Tattoos tell stories of lineage, survival, healing, and identity. Beneath the ink lie blueprints of ancient knowledge, etched not just into skin, but into very memory of cultures across time. Today's guest, Dr. Lars Krutak, has dedicated his life to uncovering these stories. An anthropologist, a writer, and a documentarian, Lars has spent more than 2 decades traveling the indigenous world to document tattoo traditions as sacred living archives. From the Philippines to the Arctic Circle, he's collected with over 50 indigenous societies in 20-plus countries, revealing how tattoos are more than just aesthetics. They're medicine, protection, and resistance. Join us on this episode of Beyond the Art as we explore the anthropology of ink, the politics of cultural preservation, and the deep roots of embodied memory. Lars, welcome to Beyond the Arts. You've brought so many hidden stories to the surface. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to speaking with your listeners on Beyond the Art, and I really appreciate your interest.
Oh, yeah, no, we're grateful that you're here. You've been called the tattoo anthropologist. Your work goes far deeper than just documenting art forms. What first drew you to the world of traditional tattoos? And when did you realize that this was going to be a lifelong journey?
Yeah, so I guess we have to go back in time to the mid-90s. At that time, I was sort of like a newly minted undergraduate, and I had my first job working in an art gallery in the Bay Area in San Francisco, actually, right down the street from the Art Institute on Chestnut Street. And luckily, I was exposed to, tribal art as well as, fine painting, the Bay Area School, whatnot. But it was right around the corner from Don Ed Hardy's tattoo shop, which just closed down not too long ago. I didn't have any tattoos. I wasn't really interested, but something stuck in my mind. And then, about a year later, I attended graduate school for my master's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And that's where I was introduced to Indigenous tattoos. Literally within 2 weeks of walking across campus, I moved there stupidly in January of 1996, and it was minus 55. So in the dim light of the winter, which there's not a whole lot of light, 4 or 5 hours, but it's like dawn lit light. I came across a woman. I later learned who she was and her name, and I've worked with her in publication projects. But she was a Gwich'in interior Athabascan elder, activist, and writer who had 3 chin tattoos, 3 chin stripes. In California, they call them triple ones. And so I was really fascinated by it because I didn't have any tattoos. I didn't know anything about Indigenous tattooing. And then I started digging in the archives, and I found out, well, heck, it seems like everywhere across the Indigenous North, from East Greenland to Siberia and everywhere in between, seemingly all of the indigenous peoples had some form of tattooing, but it's sort of fallen by the wayside because of missionization, the boarding school era. And so I just wanted to dig deeper. And then I found out about a small group, well, probably the last largest group of traditionally tattooed elders still living on the small island it's called St. Lawrence Island off the coast of Nome. It's actually closer to Siberia. So these are St. Lawrence Island Yupik people. And about that time, there was about 12 elders. They're all in their 90s. There was one living tattooist, and she was almost 100. So I wrote to the village councils and asked permission if I could come and perhaps focus my master's research on their Indigenous tattooing traditions. And I soon learned that a lot of what I was hearing was related to the biographies of these women and how these tattoos mark significant, social achievements, and they're basically their life stories on their skin, like visual storytelling, if you will. And so from there, I began wondering, because at that time, the mid-90s, there really wasn't like now. There's this huge revival of tattooing across the circumpolar north and across Native North America, for that matter. But there wasn't that kind of, revitalization movement happening at that time. It took like a generation later. And so I was really concerned, maybe these elders, they're very elderly. Perhaps in the next 5 or so years, they'll all pass away. So how many other places around the world, the indigenous world, is this also likely to occur? So I just started finding ways to travel, working odd jobs, dog walking, roofing, construction, then writing for tattoo magazines and putting that money back into so I could, for my travel funds, because I've largely self-funded most of this research, to be honest with you. And then that's how it all started for me. And fortunately, I've been able over the last almost 30 years, been able to work with, more than 50 to 60 indigenous groups in 50 to 60 countries, and have interviewed and photographed hundreds and hundreds of tattooed elders. And without the support of their community leaders, their families, and themselves, I would never be able to have embarked on this research, which is I'm really passionate about. Sort of forget about everything when I'm in the field. I'm like so laser focused on like interviewing as many elders and giving voice to their stories and their biographies behind the tattoos that they wear on their bodies and their faces.
Well, that's a true passion, and that's admirable that you're able to lose yourself in this research. As someone who has researched tattooing practices globally, what have you learned about the universal language of skin and symbol across cultures?
Well, honestly, I've learned a lot, but we don't have to go too far, like, into theorize, I would say, into the meanings behind indigenous tattooing. I mean, if you look at most of the verbs or the indigenous terms for tattooing, in many instances, they translate to writing on the skin, as a form of visual storytelling. So if you are, armed with a vocabulary, you can tell, like I said earlier when I opened, you can tell a lot about the biographies of those individuals. You can tell about, primarily a lot of the first tattoos that are received are related to, demarcating indigenous identity vis-a-vis other indigenous groups. So there are tribal identifiers. There's also clan identifiers. There's family identifiers. Then there's, rite of passage tattoos, quote unquote, So marking significant life stages, like leaving behind a former self and creating a new sort of identity, within your community. Then there are others that are related to social achievements. So perhaps, if you're a great seamstress or a textile maker, and achieve certain levels, or warriors, or, hunters. In many indigenous locations, like, men could never earn the right to be tattooed unless they had proven themselves on the battlefield. And oftentimes that was by taking another's life. Then there's a lot of spiritual concepts related to indigenous tattoos. Like ones that are associated with a guardian spirit or a tutelary spirit that may become part of you for the rest of your life if you wear a mark related to it. And there are certain offerings given to it throughout your lifetime. And one thing that almost cross-culturally, almost everywhere I've been, is that most elders have told me that, you weren't properly enculturated into your society, or were you even considered to be an ideal man or woman in the eyes of the community or the ancestors without having your traditional marks. And honestly, I'd say invariably, the majority of the indigenous groups I've worked with, elders have told me that they believe that their tattoos are their only possessions that travel with them into the afterlife, so that they can be recognized by their ancestors because they're a tribal marker of identity. But in some cases, tattoos serve other purposes in the afterlife. They can be exchanged for provisions, but it just depends, on a case-by-case basis, what indigenous society we're talking about.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating how that translates over to the other side. You've as you said, you've worked with more than 50 indigenous communities. What does ethical collaboration look like to you, especially when documenting sacred or ceremonial practices?
So, sorry, but there was like a truck driving by, and I kind of lost you there because so I think you're talking about ethical practices and ethics.
Yes, I can redo the question here.
Yeah, can you say that again? Because there's like a UPS delivery or something, and it like
no worries. So you've worked with more than 50 indigenous communities. What does ethical collaboration look like to you, especially when documenting sacred or ceremonial practices?
Yeah, so before I go into the field, I ensure that I have the consent of the community, either leadership first of all, because it's the first people that I go and meet with when I arrive in an indigenous community, to explain why I'm there, what I'm doing, what types of questions I might be asking. And then based on their guidance, they're the ones who direct me to, the families of of elders who wish to share their stories with me. And then I do the same explanation, of course, when I'm typically meeting with family members. But invariably, I'm working with people's grandparents. So almost all of my research are with elders. And I got to tell you that I've really never been like turned away. I think maybe because I approach it, very carefully. But the other thing is, as an icebreaker, I do have tattoos. So even though I don't speak these indigenous languages, I have to usually rely on an interpreter, of course. I do share something immediately with them, and that is that my skin is heavily marked. I don't have facial tattoos, but other parts of my body. And the other thing is that's really important, I think, in conducting this research is that I do bring a lot of useful items, not only for the elders I'm working with, but family members in the community. So I'm talking a lot of beads and eyeglasses. Like I always bring dozens and dozens and dozens of pairs of different readers of different powers, because it's amazing how useful those can be and how hard these communities are pretty far flung in some cases, like in Asia, a very remote area that back in the day would require a restricted area permit that I'd have to get for the government to even travel there, because a lot of folks would barred from entering for various reasons. Don't want to go into that. But yeah, it's all about consent. And then, invariably based on the visual nature of this research, photography is a key component of it to document and record it. So you become basically a portrait photographer. When I started, I was still working with film. So when I was working on St. Lawrence Island, slide film, and then we move into the digital world. So I've sort of spanned all of those decades with technology. And then the key is when you're done with your research is to share the results with that community, because it's more valuable to these communities than it is to you or me, right? So it's critical to return your publications, or when I typically speaking, revisit these communities numerous times. Like I've been working in, let's say, for instance, this one community in the northern Philippines for almost 20 years. And I've been there probably 7 or 8 times. I've been working in Nagaland in northeastern India, and the Naga region also borders into northwestern Myanmar, about 8 different occasions. So building rapport and trust through repeated visitation, breaking bread with people, having coffee, having meals, sleeping in their homes, sharing stories, sharing gifts, bringing photographs, historic photographs. Sometimes I've been there, conducting research, and I pull out a copy of a photograph and someone recognizes a family member they've never had a photograph of before. And that kind of goes back to St. Lawrence Island, because I've done a lot of work with the St. Lawrence Island community that's not related to tattooing. When I at various stages of my career, I've had different jobs, and one was working as a repatriation case officer and an archaeologist at the National Museum of the American Indian Smithsonian, as well as the National Museum of Natural History. And I actually was fortunate enough to be able to write repatriation reports to help return ancestral remains and funerary objects to the two St. Lawrence Island communities. Wow. And also, after I'd conducted my initial research, I helped work on a team of local collaborators to produce the St. Lawrence Island History Source Book, which is mainly a lot of visual resources and documentary records that were locked away in the Smithsonian archives that were returned as a people's resource to every single home on the island. So we're talking about a 450-page book or so, and 1,500 copies were basically sent back and shared to the island. So it's really important, to share the results of your research. And another example is, in 2010, I wrote the first book on Kalinga tattooing, which is this one indigenous group I was speaking about a second ago that I've made repeated visits to in the northern Philippines. And that's a really big 8-pound, coffee table book all about the history of the Kalinga tattoo and its master practitioner, who at the time of printing was, in her upper 80s and 90s. But my publishers in Germany, and we shipped a pallet load of those books all the way to the northern Philippines, and they were distributed to local schools and, of course, and all the elders that were featured in the book. So it's really important that these resources return to the communities, to their source of origin. And I try to do the best that I can, given my my funds and, my publishers' possibilities. So I think I have a pretty good track record,
That sounds amazing. I'm going to pause it 1 second here. I have some students coming through.
No worries. I'll grab a quick drink of water.
Okay. You've explored tattoos not just as an art, but as medicine, as cosmology. Sorry, as cosmology and as historical record. Can you share an example where tattooing played a healing or spiritual role in the community that you worked with?
Yeah, well, I've been documenting sort of the healing power of tattoos physically and, psychologically, spiritually, I think since the get-go. See, I was really fortunate to begin my research on St. Lawrence Island because, well, the history of tattooing there is almost unbroken for over 2,000 years. And the reason why we know that is because, as I've written extensively, including in my new book, Indigenous Tattoo Traditions by Princeton University Press that just came out a couple weeks ago in May 2025. The ancestors of the St. Lawrence Island peoples, the prehistoric indigenous peoples, left behind these beautiful anthropomorphic ivory dolls of men and women, most likely of very important personages that probably had names. But their facial and body tattoos were inscribed into the surfaces of this ancient ivory very carefully, for different reasons, which I could talk about. But what's not only the continuity and practice of tattooing there is quite ancient, but there's medicinal tattoos related to like acupuncture-like therapy. There are sort of tattoos of these stick-like figurines called yugak, or powerful persons, which basically represent an ancestral personage. And by tattooing on your body, you sort of appropriate or channel their personhood, if you will, to your benefit. Now, that could be in hunting or, to become a better warrior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are other sort of more like sympathetic magic tattoos, if you want to call it that would, if you were tattooed with these particular symbols, it'd allow you to harpoon better, especially when you're going out on a whale hunt, which is extremely dangerous, especially in the frigid waters, because if you're thrown overboard, hypothermia sets in just a couple of minutes and you'll pass away. So very dangerous, indeed. And then there are also markings related to treating infertility. So these sort of medicinal concepts of tattooing, and there's so many different variations and levels to it on St. Lawrence Island. It's really informed my research moving forward, because I'm always looking for the smallest marks, like ones that seem to be insignificant. And I think a lot of people that were conducting maybe or were interested in indigenous tattooing, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, these were probably marks that they weren't interested in, they weren't that sexy. But I often find that the smallest tattoos have some of the most important meanings. And more often than not, the isolated marks I'm talking about are typically related to treatments related to relieving arthritis or joint injuries and sprains. Sometimes medicinal plants or substances are mixed in to the incisions, but sometimes not. And I've always found that these markings are incredibly important. And actually, the oldest evidence we have of human tattooing comes from the European Iceman, who's over 5,000 years old. And over 80% of his tattoos are believed to correlate to medicinal therapy akin to acupuncture, because when they conducted CT scans of his body, he was racked by arthritis. And these markings are so dark to this day that scholars believe that he didn't just receive them at one time. He was tattooed over this course of his life many, many times, because, he was traumatized by these ailments that plagued him for his entire life. So anyhow, this is a pretty widespread tradition, not only in Alaska, but I've come across clans in Borneo that have medicinal tattoos that look very similar to the Iceman, placed in the same joint articulations, namely because of joint sprains. And within 5 to 7 days, the full mobility is restored to those limbs. But then again, they re-injure them and so they needle the same area again, and that's why they're so dark. And I've been documenting these for a long, long time.
So in so many cultures, tattoos were intentionally erased or stigmatized by colonization. How do you see tattooing today as an act of cultural resurgence or resistance?
Well, if we're getting back to the healing aspect of tattoos, especially today, as I mentioned at the top, tattooing was one of the first things to go when missionaries arrived in North America and across the indigenous world, namely because they were associated with all of these concepts we're talking about: spirituality, indigenous medicine, indigenous identity, indigenous rites of passage. And that's the first thing that the colonizers wanted to stamp out so that they could assimilate indigenous peoples into Western culture. And then, of course, the boarding school era, forcibly removing children and dislocating them from their culture and also their tattooing practices, if there was, tattooing being practiced in that particular community, that had to go by the wayside. And in some cases, traditional healers or, shamanic or priest or priestess-like figures were the ones responsible for applying indigenous tattoos. So these missionaries and government agents of assimilation certainly wanted to dislocate indigenous peoples from those individuals, and and their indigenous religions, which were animistic and based on spiritual entities in the environment, animals, ancestral spirits, etc. So that's one of the reasons why tattooing, began to disappear so long ago. And in some cases in the indigenous world, it was utterly extinct, by the turn of the 20th century. And then there's just only vestiges of it, like let's say in St. Lawrence Island, for instance. In the mid 90s, there was, less than a dozen women that carried aspects or just like not full complements of tattoos that their ancestors would have received in the 1800s, but bits and pieces, incomplete tattoos. And these basically the women that were still alive when I was interviewing them, they were all pretty much from the same age set and were tattooed. They were the last group to be tattooed around 1920.
Wow. So you've worked in the museum world as a repatriation officer and as an archaeologist. How do you reconcile working in institutions with colonial legacies while also trying to dismantle them?
Yeah, and actually, I want to go back to your last question because I didn't actually completely answer it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, in my new book, Indigenous Tattoo Traditions, as well as Tattoo Traditions of Native North America, which I published in 2014, which is the first single volume on the history of indigenous tattooing across Native North America. The tattoo revitalization movements that have been happening over the last 15 to 20 years, well, in some cases longer than that, especially in California, tattooing is definitely associated with healing those cultural wounds that were opened, during the early missionary period, especially the boarding school era. There were also new forms of tattooing that were created in boarding schools as a form of resistance, which I speak about, not in the new book, but in Tattoo Traditions of Asia. And other authors, indigenous authors, Native North American authors have spoken about this, have written about this at length, much more so than I have. But I'm saying it promotes a sense of healing because tattoos, especially if they're placed on the face, which is a very public location, perhaps the most public location of all, is reaffirming indigenous existence. We are still here. We will continue to be here, and we will continue to persist because we are resilient. And we're proud to wear our culture on our face or on our bodies or wherever. And I think that's really significant, honestly. And in that sense, tattoos are a form of healing, of reclaiming identities, of reclaiming bodies, of reclaiming your spirituality and your connection with your ancestral community, as well as that community today.
Yeah. As you were speaking about tattoos in boarding schools, I was thinking back. So if you see behind me is a classroom. I'm teaching at a summer institute right now, the Oscar Haussmer Art Institute. And 30 years ago, I was a student here in high school. And I recall one night as a student, some of the kids were all gathered in one of the dorm rooms. And one of the kids had brought some India ink and some needles, and they were all tattooing on their feet, sort of like a group. A group, not a project, because it was after hours. It was late at night, and the kids were up late, and they're all giving themselves tattoos. And it turned into this really great bonding experience for the kids. And while the experience in itself of being at this institute is a really empowering and a real significant experience, it was that moment with those kids that really bonded them as a group of individuals, more so than just some sort of group experience with this program. So it just kind of connected me with a period in my past as well, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, tattooing is definitely more than skin deep, as they say, for many different reasons. And honestly, sort of to go back to one of your questions, sort of negotiating or the balancing act, working as an archaeologist, let's say at the Smithsonian, doing knowledge repatriation there, speaking about the St. Lawrence Island source book, and of course, sort of the knowledge repatriation in some sense that I do, or at least a knowledge recording that I'm doing and then repatriating the community in some sense. Yeah, it's a fine balancing act, and it comes with a lot of responsibility, and I don't take that lightly, I know that some of my editors are probably perturbed by me because I love to put in big block quotes in my publications, because I'd rather you hear directly from the elders in their own voices rather than Mr. Krutak, the filterer. So, whenever I can, if I could put pages of quotes in, I would, but oftentimes the editor's pen chopping block, comes into the fold, and you have to, follow those guidelines. So I know I push the limits there, that's for sure. But I think it's extremely important to let my collaborators speak for themselves. After all, this is a collaboration. I couldn't do any of the projects, none of my publications, none of the museum exhibitions that I've curated, without, a team involved. It wouldn't be possible without their consent, without their approval, and their support. So, and I gotta say again, I maybe I overstate this, but my first experience on St. Lawrence Island sticks with me in other ways because, granted, I was at the time, studying to be a historical archaeologist, but then I turned to the dark side of cultural anthropology and I started studying tattooing. St. Lawrence Island has a very long history of archaeological exploration, especially from Smithsonian archaeologists. Who had been going there for over 100 years before I arrived in 1997 on the island. And the elders told me, I've heard this repeatedly, is that, those archaeologists, you archaeologists, have been coming to this island and taking and never giving anything back. And so that's really stuck with me. That's sort of been my mantra, if you will, is to give back whenever I can. And so that stuck with me when I was writing reports to repatriate ancestral human remains and funerary objects to the St. Lawrence Islanders, when we did the St. Lawrence history population history source book. And of course, I've done other projects outside of these with that community, as well as the others that I've been working with for over 30 years. So that's always stuck with me, is like, whenever we can give back, that's the most important thing that at least I can do. And I know other people are doing that as well, but I'm just saying it's a really important aspect of my research, and it guides everything that I do.
Which is wonderful to hear. I too have spent years in the museum world, and I've been to a lot of meetings where essentially the elders are now calling out museums directors, during meetings about how museums and professionals will come and they'll take and they'll take and they'll take, and they'll never see people again, until the next generation with who are seeking new degrees and writing new books and everything that will come and take from them and take their knowledge. My father, who was an elder, would brag that he never had even a high school degree, but doctoral candidates would come out and get their education from him. And so that was, that's a theme that's across No, I mean, it's across all aspects of our traditional lives. Is
No,
seeing people come.
absolutely. I mean, that cultural knowledge, I mean, you can't you can't compare it to a degree that you can get at the university, you know.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you're enculturated into a place. You live in a landscape that's composed of many different spheres and elements, and there's so much to be gained, and there's so much traditional knowledge, ecological and spiritual and otherwise, that you just can't necessarily teach in an academic environment, obviously.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
unless you're acculturated and ingrained in those communities and those places and those landscapes and with those connections to your ancestral community, then there's no substitute for that, in my
Yeah.
opinion. And I'm always going to be a cultural outsider no matter where I go, but I accept that. I'm always learning, when I'm traveling. Of course, that's why I make repeated visits, because I forget to ask questions, or I'm going through my notebook when I'm at home. I'm like, oh, why didn't I ask that obvious follow-up question? Because oftentimes I'm also working with the last person in a community or maybe in an entire society that has this one tattoo. And I've seen many of these elders pass away over the course of doing this research. And I honestly, it's a privilege and an honor to have, I guess, to have been allowed to do this research at that time. I mean, honestly, I'm glad I was born when I was born and I was able to start this research 30 years ago, because so much has already been lost. But there's hope, because I know, like in the Arctic example, it took a generation for folks to start rekindling their tattooing traditions. And if there's I think it's really important that there's a baseline to go to, or at least a compilation of data. If anything, that the Tattoo Traditions of Native North America book that I put in 2014. Granted, I did travel across Indian country, and I interviewed a lot of people from Alaska to Oklahoma to New York State to California and other Great Lakes to other places. But a lot of it is archival research, digging up, unpublished materials and obscure archives and bringing them to the community so that they can use them. And at least, to acknowledge where they exist so that people can dig further that belong to these communities. And I do a lot of sharing, honestly. I have a lot of Indigenous community members, Canadian First Nations, Native American scholars who I share information whenever I can. I mean, if anybody writes me, they contact me, I will share whatever I can. I try to do it in a timely manner. So if anything, if that's all that I do is just share resources so other folks can pick up the mantle, that's great. And I feel like that's a really important part of the research that I've been fortunate enough to conduct here for so long.
Is there a tattoo tradition or a cultural story that remains largely unknown to the public, but you feel deserves more attention?
Well, honestly, I think there's not one story, but I think there are many stories. There are still many Indigenous communities that I can think of that more research could be done. There's still elders that haven't shared their stories. I was just reminded yesterday, I had some friends that were traveling to a remote region, a remote river valley in the Brazilian Amazon. And elders I relayed a bunch of questions because I couldn't be there on this particular trip. And so they were able to ask a bunch of elders from this indigenous group, the Marubo. And they were basically telling me that there's only one woman left with the facial tattoos of their group. And so, it's really important that people get out into the field and go to locations like that, ask the right questions with consent, of course, because there's so much more that can be done. And like I said, just to record and document this information for future generations in the event, that somebody wants to pick it up in the future. Because when it's gone and it's fleeting and it won't be there forever. So we're sort of at a critical time now in places like that. And I can think of other locations in Asia and Africa, that much more could be done. And honestly, anybody can really do it. You don't have to have a PhD. You need a notebook. You need consent, maybe a camera. And you can, in your own communities. I mean, I've been to many locations where people are like, who's that strange guy? Why is he talking to all my relatives, especially my elders and my aunties, about their tattoos? And then, I get a big group surrounding me. And then when I'm done, paying all of this attention to, XYZ's aunties and uncles, they come up to me and they say, you know what? You made me realize that I didn't realize how fleeting this is, because I feel like any day I can go talk to my auntie and I could ask her these questions, but I just think that she's going to be here forever. Like, I can always go ask her something. But honestly, maybe she won't be here much longer. And I didn't take the opportunity to go and ask her about her life and about her story, and to value her knowledge. So if that's all that I'm doing is like promoting awareness within communities of why I think these, markings are important, then I feel like I'm doing my job.
I think that's such an incredible thing to raise awareness, right? Because so many, I mean, I've had so many conversations, especially on these podcasts, where, we miss the opportunity to speak with certain elders at a certain point, and so often, even with speaking with elders, because they missed something out when they were younger, and you come up with these questions oftentimes when it's too late. So the fact that you're in those communities, sparking that interest, I think that's an incredible. I don't mean, for the lack of a better term, it's an incredible byproduct of the work that you're doing, is creating interest within the community themselves, maybe inspiring someone to sort of pick up this curiosity and move forward with it.
Well, and it's also a grind. I mean, let's talk about the methodology just a second. I mean, I know I tire out my translators because oftentimes, I'm in a limited budget, as we noted before. A lot of this is self-funded research. It has been. And so I'm trying to speak with as many elders and hit as many communities as I possibly can within a limited time frame before my funding runs out. And so you ask the same question over and over and over again, and your translator, you can tell they're fatigued. Like, we've never gotten an answer. They're like, oh, it's just for art. Oh, we just did it because it was an ancestral tradition. Hey, that's a perfectly valid answer, honestly. Mm-hmm. But if you don't keep on pounding the pavement, you're not going to have those breakthrough moments when you find somebody who, when they were a little kid, their elders were talking about tattooing or related, rituals or whatever. And they were hiding behind a tree, and, they scared everybody else away, and then they were just intent and listening. And so you find these gatekeepers. Sometimes, you might interview 20 people, and then you finally have this breakthrough moment. And those are the most magical moments for me. I mean, I've had them everywhere. You sit there and you're like, oh my God, I know there's more to it than what I'm hearing. But then again, I'm a cultural outsider. I mean, I'm not expecting anybody just to, give away their culture and,
Yeah.
But oftentimes, like you were saying, it's been so long since these skin marking practices were regularly practiced that some of it's sort of been forgotten, like the rituals, even the words surrounding certain tattooing motifs. Things are forgotten or memories are hazy. That's why it's important to bring a lot of visual aids, because that stimulates a lot. So visual elicitation or photo elicitation, bring a lot of historical resources and people with tattoos and things like that, as well as vocabulary lists, which I come with. But that oftentimes happens. And so it gets to be very frustrating at times. But again, then you have those breakthrough moments, and it's like worth everything, that's why I'm here to do it, and to do it the right way. Don't give up and keep on pushing, even when I'm sick or I'm, I have dysentery or whatever. I just think I've had it all. That's why I work alone. I don't really like to travel with anybody else, because if I'm sick, I'm going to keep on working, no matter if I'm in northwestern Myanmar or jungle of Borneo or the Amazon or wherever. I will continue to go until I can't go any further, until I go home. That's how important it is to me. And I mean, I kind of forget about everything else. I don't forget about my family. My wife is listening and my daughter. But sometimes you're so in the element and, I'm possessed. But it keeps me, moving along. So for those breakthrough moments.
So a quick shift. If you could receive a traditional tattoo from any culture that you've studied, where would it be from and what would it represent?
Well, I've received every single indigenous technique. So honestly, I have many, many tattoos. I mean, I don't know, 40, 50. My legs are my sleeves, as well as my backside and my back and my upper arms and things like that. Honestly, there wouldn't be one that I haven't received yet or that I would be looking to get. And all of these tattoos are equally important to me because, they mark a particular moment in time, a particular moment with that individual who gave it to me, as well as the people that might have been sharing that experience in the room, or if it was outside or wherever it was. And so those are all deeply personal to me, in an individualistic way, like being in that particular community at that particular time, in that particular moment. And there's nothing that I can think of right now, like one place that I haven't been to or that I would like to, receive a tattoo, honestly, because I feel like I've already experienced and I've already sort of shared those moments with many different people and many different communities. And that's good enough for me. So.
What's a ritual or a practice from your fieldwork that you've adopted into your daily life?
A ritual practice?
A ritual or a practice? Yep. What's a ritual or a practice from your fieldwork that you've observed that you've adopted into your daily life? Has any of the cultural work practices imprinted onto yourself that you've brought into your life?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question. I mean, I think I sort of already answered it. And that really goes back to giving back. That's the most important thing that I took away from my first experience working in the field. The first time I was ever in an indigenous community, the first moment I ever took a photograph of an indigenously tattooed person on St. Lawrence Island, is when that one elder said that you guys, you archaeologists, anthropologists, you scientists, you scholars are all about taking, and never giving back. That's what's followed me through everything that I do. I remember that statement every time I go someplace and try to find ways to give back, when I can. I mean, some of these places are so isolated, they're difficult to get back to, or it's impossible to send a parcel there, but I've sent plenty of books via couriers to get them to where they need to be, where there are no roads that exist. And you can only get there by motorcycle or trail. So that is the most important, I think, sort of, ritual, if you will, that guides everything that I do and has really guided everything, since the beginning.
Okay. Well, give us a fun fact. What's something that people might be surprised to learn about Dr. Lars Krutak?
Well, I don't know if there's anything too surprising or a fun fact about myself, honestly. But I could tell you a fun fact about indigenous tattooing, especially from the Northwest Coast, that a lot of people may not know about.
Okay.
Well, honestly, you all probably know, I know some of your listeners definitely know about this. But on the Northwest Coast, there's a long tradition of wood carving, especially crests. So like totem poles, family crests, clan crests, they basically cover, or they're enmeshed, embodied within pretty much many forms of material culture. But in the late 19th century, the Haida, especially Haida Tlingit and other Northwest Coast groups, but especially the Haida, they had a tradition of tattooing. Originally, their tattoos were stitched in subdermally, and then eventually they migrated to a sort of a poking technique. There's still one set of tools that actually exist in the Smithsonian Museum, National Museum of Natural History, that are a Haida hand poking kit, tattooing kit, and they actually do have crest symbols in each one of the cedar batons that are used to poke in the tattoos. Anyhow, in the late 19th century, Haida men and women were made to feel ashamed of their crest tattoos, especially women, because, missionaries were responsible, government agents that wanted to assimilate them into wider Western culture. And oftentimes women that were heavily tattooed with crest tattoos on their forearms and their hands would wear gloves when they were photographed. But one Haida chief and artist, Charles Edenshaw, was compelled, because he had heavily tattooed female members in his family with crests, to begin inscribing crests into silver cuffs and jewelry. And so this led to the tradition of crest jewelry, especially with Haida and filtered throughout the Northwest coast. And it's an artistic medium that, through innovation, was inspired by tattoos, and it continues to this day. And I think it's fascinating, and it's sort of a little known factoid that a lot of people aren't aware of. But this speaks to not only Charles Edenshaw's innovation, but there are many other Indigenous tattoo artists that are working today that are pushing the boundaries of their artistry. I don't want to call it a craft, because one of the issues that I bring up in my new book, Indigenous Tattoo Traditions, is that many anthropologists and art historians, in previous times, saw tattooing, Indigenous tattooing, as a craft, as a collective and repetitive practice, rather than an individualized art that was created by renowned master artisans. And so consequently, most of the names of tattoo artists, especially if there's a photograph of a Haida tattooist in a book, or an Indigenous tattooist tattooing somebody, their names were never recorded, because this was seen as a craft and not as an art form, right? I state in my book, basically most of the tattoo artists from in historic era photographs and whatnot, or historical era records, we don't know their names. They're basically unknown. But I am positive, based on my research with contemporary with Indigenous tattoo artists that are now elders in their community, they were often known locally or even regionally for their expertise. But, if we go back to the ethnographic record, we basically rarely will we know who their names are, because they're just anonymous craftspeople, So I want to also bring awareness to the fact that there have been tattoo masters in the Indigenous world since time immemorial. And it's unfortunate that we don't know many of their names. But whenever I can put their names to a photograph, or an oral history, or tie it to a community, I do that, because I think it's really important to treat them as humans, and not as, objects, that remained unnamed because they're like specimens for the curiosity cabinet, or what have you. Like Maori postcards that were produced around the early 1900s, some of them are titled like specimen of a Maori chief. Now, is there any name given? Oftentimes not. So those are the types of things that I like to dispel, and try to, give some ounce of humanity to these individuals who, were responsible for the perpetuation of tattooing across the centuries, so that their ancestors could pick it up and move it forward today and into the future for future generations.
I think that's wonderful. Would you be able to remind the listener where they can find your work, be able to pick up one of your books, or to order them?
Yeah, sure. You can learn more about my work through my Instagram channel, Lars Krutak. I also have a website, so it's larskrutak.com. I also have a Facebook page. It's The Tattoo Hunter, namely, because I used to host a TV series called The Tattoo Hunter for the Discovery Channel. But that was a long time ago. You can find some legacy episodes somewhere on YouTube. But anyhow, yeah, so I'm pretty easy to find. And then I also try to share most of my publications and research through my academia.edu portal. So I have, God, I don't know, probably 100 publications there, anywhere from magazines to edited volumes, like book chapters, not entire books because my publishers would probably take me to court. But you can find most of my work there, and I try to share as much as possible if I'm allowed. Some of those publications are watermarked, but at least you get to read it. You just have to look beyond the watermark. So I'm easy to find.
Oh, that's fantastic. Before we go, is there anything you would like to leave the listener?
No, I just like to thank you for your time and your interest. I just think, indigenous tattooing traditions are so vital to our understanding of human history as a cultural expression and as a contribution to the world's cultural heritage that have been often unrecognized for far too long. But I think that we can learn a lot about not only indigenous peoples, but ourselves by immersing ourselves into these worlds of ink, because they're much more deep than the skin. So
yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. This was a really great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. And I thank all the listeners for listening, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thank you. Dr. Lars Krutak reminds us that skin can be scripture, that long before museums, books, or data, our bodies carried the stories of our people, etched in ink, memory, and meaning. His work is not just about preservation, it's about reciprocity, cultural repair, and the radical act of listening. Lars, thank you for honoring Indigenous voices and helping the world see tattooing not as a trend, but as a sacred, enduring legacy. This has been Beyond the Art. Until next time, carry your stories, protect your symbols, and never forget the power that lives just beneath the surface.